everyone, this is Tyla from the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and you're listening to the Constitution at Work podcast, the series for people interested in constitutional matters and transformation in South Africa. Today, we are talking about South Africa's foreign policy and the impact it may have on international relations. As always, I'm joined by Steward, Chairperson of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and with us today is Gruzd, Head of the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and Ismail Joosub, the Foundation's Research Intern. Thank you all for joining me, and with that, let's jump straight into the discussion. So we've seen the back and forth of the ANC saying they would withdraw from the International Criminal Court to avoid its obligations as a member state to arrest Vladimir Putin, Russian president, if he attends the BRICS summit in August. In the original statement, Secretary General Fikile Mbalula said it was hypocritical to expect South Africa to arrest Putin while big powers walk free. He even went so far as to say South Africa was being punished because of its non-partisan approach to the Russia and Ukraine conflict. Stephen, I'm immediately going to turn to you. Given your extensive monitoring and reporting at SIA, has South Africa been non-partisan to this conflict?
So I think there's a difference between what you say and what you do. South Africa has claimed to be non-aligned, to be neutral on this conflict, to be pushing for peace and for discussions to end the violence. But there have been so many actions by the South African government that show that it is very friendly towards Moscow and is leaning towards Moscow. I mean, I think that probably the biggest was doing the MOSI 2 naval exercises with China and Russia right over the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. So that was particularly bad timing in my view, and drew a lot of attention to what I've done, say, if these exercises were held later in the year, for example. So I think Russia and China definitely used that as a propaganda opportunity. South Africa has sent conferences. The ANC sent a delegation to meet Putin's party. Parliamentarians have been there. Our Minister of Defense has been there. These are, all signs where many Western countries, for example, have tried to cut off Russia and to totally sanction Russia. They would never be caught attending events. South Africa has been a frequent visitor. We even had the ANC Youth League going to observe the referenda that were held on the 4 disputed areas in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. And the ANC Youth League roundly said this was a free and fair poll and that this was the will of the people being expressed, whereas most of other observers, really criticized that exercise. So there have been a number of actions really that undermine South Africa's claim to be non-aligned and neutral. And this has not gone unnoticed around the world.
Thank you for that. So Ismail, what are South Africa's obligations then under international law? And is the ICC a compulsory court that all states need to adhere to?
Thank you for the question, Tyla. Let's rewind just a little bit back to 1994 when South Africa became a constitutional democracy. The new government began a process of wanting to build a united and democratic South Africa that was able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state within the family of nations. And so we wanted to ensure that the significance of international legal norms find their place in domestic law as well. Take Section 39(1)(b) of the Constitution, for instance, enjoins domestic courts to consider international law when interpreting the Bill of Rights. Section 233 further provides that when interpreting any legislation, an interpretation should be favorable to international law. And so the Constitution domestically has become an iconic symbol of South Africa's commitment to upholding the rule of law and protecting and advancing international human rights. So it is in this context, then, that it's no surprise that on the 17th of July, 1998, South Africa signed and then subsequently deposited its instruments of ratification to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. That's when we became a member of this thing called the International Criminal Court. Now, what is the International Criminal Court? The International Criminal Court, briefly known as the ICC, is a permanent international tribunal that was established in 2002 to investigate and prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. Now, there are 4 crimes that fall within the ambit of the International Criminal Court: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and recently, the crime of aggression. The jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court extends to individuals, including heads of state or government, who bear responsibility for the commission of these crimes. So to answer your question on South Africa's obligations, our international legal obligations, because South Africa voluntarily elected to be in the company of the sovereign states that have signed the Rome Statute and have become members of the ICC, we undertook that we will be committed to cooperate with the ICC to bring international criminals to trial for offenses that fall within the ambit of the International Criminal Court. That is our primary international legal obligation in terms of the International Criminal Court, to make sure that international human rights are preserved. And to answer your second question on whether or not the International Criminal Court is a compulsory court, this is not the case. The ICC is a voluntary court that countries can choose to be a part of or not. The ICC is a product of the Rome Statute, which was adopted by some 120 countries in 1998. To become a party to the Rome Statute, a country must sign and ratify the treaty through its domestic legal processes. And currently, as today, there are some 123 countries that are part of the Rome Statute. So no, it's not a compulsory court. It's completely voluntary, and South Africa has voluntarily decided to be a part of this court.
And just to note that even if we want to withdraw from the ICC, it will only become effective 12 months later. So there was the ANC's commentary that that was going to be the route they took, but that wouldn't work in this situation. So I'm going to turn to what we've recently seen this week with Western Cape Premier Alan Winde saying that if Putin sets foot in the Western Cape, he will arrest him. Dave, what is the likelihood of him actually being able to follow through with this?
Well, I think the likelihood is 0. There is no way that the Premier of the Western Cape is going to arrest the leader of one of the 3 most powerful countries in the world. It's simply not going to happen. There are also great questions as to the role and the right that the Premier of the Western Cape has to intervene in international relations, which are the sphere of the national government. Much as we may disagree with Vladimir Putin, much as we may dislike his activities, his invasion of Ukraine, these powers simply do not belong to the Premier of the Western Cape. I think it's grandstanding. I think Alan Winde is taking advantage of the situation to generate some positive publicity.
So I was chatting to a colleague about this who said that it shows disapproval for the national government stance, if nothing else. Stephen, do you think that this type of public disapproval is likely to change the ANC stance, though?
No, I don't think so. I think it's also a bit of a moot point because the summit is planned for Durban, which is not in the Western Cape. So it's not like Winde would be expecting Putin to come anyway. So I agree that it is publicity seeking. I don't think that the ANC really bothers much about what the Democratic Alliance says. And certainly, but we have seen differences. I mean, one of the things that was done early on in the war was cities around the world illuminated famous buildings in the colors of the Ukraine flag, the yellow and blue. And Cape Town was quite noticeable in having done that. So you have a metro that's run by the Democratic Alliance and a province that's run by the Democratic Alliance. But of course, the national government is run by the ANC. And so I think it does look for opportunities to differentiate itself from the national government. But it does bring into the questions that Dave has mentioned on what are the competencies and responsibilities and obligations and roles of provincial governments in international relations. We see some American states are very prominent, like California almost has its own international relations apart from what is happening through Washington. So it's not as cut and dried as it might once have been. But yes, given that there's no realistic prospect that Putin is going to go to the Western Cape, I don't think I think it's a moot point.
So, Dave, you've written extensively on the alliance of the ANC to the South African Communist Party and communism in general. Does this underlie the ANC stance to Russia?
Yes, I think it plays a very major role. There is an old sense of loyalty toward Russia, even though it's no longer a communist country, on the part of many of the people who were involved in the ANC-SACP struggle. And I suppose that is to be expected. However, when a country decides on its international relations, its international policy, it has to take a whole lot of things into consideration. It has to take its international legal obligations into consideration, the fact that we are a member of the ICC. It has to take into consideration national interest. Where does the national interest lie in terms of trade, security, investment? It has to take into account also the values on which the country has been founded. Our constitution is a classical democratic constitution with freedom based on universal franchise, freedom of speech, and we should be aligned to countries that have similar values. That shouldn't be the final determining factor. The Americans were in alliance with the Soviets during the Second World War. So one has to take into account all of these factors: your interests, your old loyalties, your legal obligations, and the kind of values on which your society is based. I would have thought that looking at that total package, it would be much wiser not to cozy up to a country with which we have hardly any trade, and to alienate countries that are responsible for the overwhelming volume of investment and trade with this country. So it seems to me to be a little bit unwise.
But it seems we have a precedent of shaky relationships with ICC obligations. Ismail, can you give us a brief overview of the Omar al-Bashir controversy, where the ANC similarly refused to arrest him?
Indeed, we do have a very shaky relationship with ICC countries, and none better so is the example of what happened with Omar al-Bashir in 2015. To give you an overview, Omar al-Bashir was a long-standing dictator of Sudan who was due to attend an African Union summit in South Africa in 2015. And by the time he'd arrived in South Africa, the ICC had issued a warrant of arrest, similar to what's happened in the Putin case, for Omar al-Bashir for a genocide that he had been committing in Darfur. Now, what South Africa should have done, as per our international legal obligations to the ICC, was indeed to arrest him. That's what was required of us by the international community, or expected of us by the international community. Instead, South Africa used the opportunity to obfuscate and blur the lines and employ delay tactics and allow Omar al-Bashir to escape through the back door without actually arresting him. And our defense for this was that President al-Bashir was protected by some level of diplomatic immunity. This argument was rejected completely by the Supreme Court of Appeal, that found that South Africa was in breach of international and domestic law, as well as of the constitution, for failing to arrest Omar al-Bashir. Now, the Putin and Bashir situations are comparable in that Bashir was also a sitting head of state at the time, and he was also subject to a warrant of arrest for atrocities that fell within the ambit of the ICC. But the argument that he was protected by diplomatic immunity falls short, because the ICC then deemed that diplomatic immunity or head of state immunity doesn't protect head of states that have committed crimes that fall within the remit of the ICC. Now, the crime that Vladimir Putin is charged for is the illegal deportation of children from occupied Ukrainian territories onto mainland Russia. And that is a crime that falls within the ambit of the ICC. It's a war crime, and so therefore no diplomatic immunity will be afforded to Putin in this regard. And we are expected by the international community to arrest Putin. But you're right, we've had a very bad tendency of playing fiddle with countries that have been indicted by the ICC. And I agree with Dave, it doesn't make sense because these countries provide very little to us in terms of trade or any other benefits.
Thank you, Ismail. Stephen, do you agree with what has been said? And specifically, I'd like to know from you, in the unlikely event that we do arrest Putin, how would this impact our trade relations? And vice versa, if SA doesn't condemn and we welcome Putin, how would that affect our international community relations?
So I think this is a big headache for the South African government. One way to solve would be if Putin would agree to attend virtually, but that would prevent there being a photo opportunity of all the leaders of the BRICS in August smiling and shaking hands, and the political of these things is very important. I mean, South Africa is in a bind because we are members of the Rome Statute. We have domesticated this law, and we should, by rights, arrest Putin if he came to South Africa. We wouldn't want to get the reputation as a country that disregards international law, but frankly, there weren't very many consequences for South Africa for not arresting Omar al-Bashir. And there was a tension with the ICC, but really not very much else happened. So it's not guaranteed that Putin is going to come. He hasn't traveled outside the former Soviet Union except to Iran in the last year or so. So he's been very cautious and careful. I think it would be diplomatically very difficult to arrest him in terms of relations with Africa. The world would be looking to South Africa to see what it does. It's tried. There've been a number of possibilities that have been mentioned. The one is withdrawal from the court, but that has seemed now to be on ice because, as you said, it wouldn't be any way from giving formal notice. And in fact, South Africa has tried to do it before, and it never really went anywhere. So I can't see, frankly, South African police arresting Putin if he came. He would probably be under very tight security, but then in defiance of its own laws and in international laws. Don't forget, there was also a court order, an urgent case was brought when Bashir was here, and that instructed government to arrest him and hand him over. Putin won't travel in the end anyway. I don't think there's some sort of a deal, that's a difficult position. If we do and we're damned if we don't. I think I see the South African police service actually barging. This is such a politically sensitive matter. It may also be all for nothing because he might not travel. He hasn't left the former Soviet Union for the last year. So there is confirmation that he haven't heard a definitive statement that says he's definitely coming. So maybe if he attends virtually, that might be one way out, but it's not good for the optics for South Africa. They like to have photographs of all five leaders smiling and shaking hands, and that would be less possible if Putin wasn't here physically. But also South Africa doesn't want to get a reputation of defying its own laws and international laws. And so the Omar al-Bashir case has precedent, and not much happened to South Africa because of that. It raised tensions with the ICC. It caused the ANC to put together some proposal to leave the ICC, which didn't go anywhere and has since been retracted. But there weren't really consequences for South Africa for not arresting Bashir. But I think the stakes are very high this time, and there are massive Western sanctions on Russia, and the world will be watching what South Africa does on this one.
Thank you, Stephen. In closing, I'm going to ask each of our speakers, how should South Africa balance its obligations under international law with its own national interests in its foreign policy decisions? Ismail, I'll start with you.
Well, I believe that South Africa, let's remember, played an important role during the drafting of the Rome Statute in the ICC in 1998. It was one of the first countries in Africa to incorporate the Rome Statute into its domestic law, is a big mover and shaker in the African continent. What we do and what we say in the international legal arena has a ripple effect throughout the continent. And to agree with what Stephen said, if we're going to garner a reputation for disregarding international norms and going against the grain when it comes to implementing international laws, then we have to realize that this is going to be bad, not just for us, but for Africa in general. And so therefore, I think that the only solution rather, would be that we adopt a more hardline approach to sticking to our international agreements and realizing that the international agreements that we've entered into are found in our domestic laws as well and cannot simply be disregarded. That's what I think should happen. And I think that more so in terms of foreign policy, we should stop cozying up to players in the international arena that are the bad guys and who don't provide us with anything and who only serve to sow division here at home, and actually align with countries with whom we have the most benefits in terms of trade and who will actually be able to offer us real substantial benefits.
Thanks, Ismail. Dave?
Well, I think Ismail has said what we should do, but it's not what we're going to do. I'm afraid that the likelihood that South Africa would ever arrest Vladimir Putin if he were to come here is zero. So either Putin participates by video link, which would not be satisfactory for BRICS, or he comes here and is not arrested. Those are the two possibilities. And that, in turn, is going to create problems for us, serious problems for us, with the countries that really matter to us in terms of trade and investment, and in fact, in terms of the values in our constitution. So, as somebody once said, we're in a pickle.
Stephen, how do you see South Africa balancing its obligations under international law with its national interests?
So South Africa is called on to balance relations on a regular basis. On the same week that we hosted Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, we also had Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury from the US. It tries as much as possible to be a friend to all and an enemy to none, to borrow a phrase that Namibia talks about a lot in its foreign policy. Look, the fact is we have obligations under international law and national law on this particular issue. But I agree with Dave. I think we are in some way going to try. We won't arrest Putin if he comes to South Africa. That's just the bottom line. But then do we really want a reputation as a rogue state? And do we want to jeopardize the very substantial trade and investment relations we have with Western countries? And so there's, they say a week is a long time in politics. I think we've got a couple of months for this to run. And I think sadly for South Africa, it's going to detract from any other BRICS business. This is the story and the agenda of what BRICS is going to talk about, the possible expansion. Yes, there will be some coverage of that, but this issue will overshadow. So it's not easy. I'd actually heard on the radio yesterday that the Justice Minister was saying that we could look at the way that we've domesticated the Rome Statute, and countries like the Netherlands and Britain have done it in such a way that sitting heads of state would get immunity. So that might be a stratagem that the government employs to pass some legislation in the next couple of weeks and months that change the way that we implement the Rome Statute to give immunity to sitting heads of state. But I don't know. I think that's a long shot. And this is going to be worked out politically as much as it's going to be worked out legally.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll definitely be monitoring the legislation to see what comes forward. Thank you, Ismail, Dave, and Stephen for joining us. And thank you to our audience for joining us for this episode of the Constitution at Work. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be alerted when our next video is up. If you have feedback on today's episode, please feel free to have your say in the comments section. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter at FW de Klerk Foundation to keep up with our latest news. We look forward to checking in again soon.